When I turned 65, I set the table for 8 people and waited for my family to walk through the door. No one came. I remember staring at the candles flickering softly in the quiet dining room, their light reflecting off the china plates I had carefully placed that afternoon. I had spent 3 weeks planning that dinner. 3 weeks choosing the menu, calling everyone to confirm, even ironing the pale blue dress hanging in my closet because my late husband, Richard, used to say that color made my eyes look brighter. 65 felt like a meaningful number to me. Not just another birthday, but a moment to gather the people I loved in the home where they had grown up. The house smelled like roasted chicken, rosemary, and fresh bread. I had set Daniel's favorite seat near the window. My grandson Ethan's place had a small slice of chocolate cake already waiting because he always asked for dessert first. Everything was ready by 6 o'clock sharp. I remember glancing at the clock on the wall and smiling to myself, imagining the sound of the doorbell and the familiar chaos that followed whenever my family arrived together. But 6 o'clock passed quietly. Then 6:30. The candles burned lower while the food cooled slowly on the kitchen counter. I checked my phone once, thinking perhaps someone had sent a message about traffic. There was nothing. By 7 o'clock the silence in the house felt heavier, like the rooms themselves were holding their breath. I walked to the front window and looked out at the empty street, half expecting to see Daniel's SUV pulling into the driveway at any moment. Instead, there were only the soft yellow streetlights and the faint sound of a car passing somewhere in the distance. I told myself families get busy. Maybe plans changed. Maybe they were preparing some kind of surprise. That thought almost made me laugh. At 65, you stop expecting surprises, especially the good kind. Still, I waited another half hour. I poured myself a glass of iced tea and sat at the dining table alone, watching the candle wax slowly drip down the sides. At 8 o'clock, I finally picked up my phone again, this time opening Facebook without really thinking about it. The first photo that appeared on my screen made my stomach tighten. It was a bright, sunny picture of my son Daniel standing on the deck of a cruise ship with the ocean stretching behind him. My grandson Ethan was leaning over the railing beside him, grinning widely at the camera. And standing right in the center of the photo, wearing oversized sunglasses and a wide white hat, was my daughter-in-law Laura. The caption beneath the picture read, "Family vacation at last." Just what we needed. I stared at the date and time under the photo. It had been posted 20 minutes earlier. I scrolled down slowly, my fingers suddenly feeling stiff. Another picture appeared. This one showed the entire family gathered around a long table on the ship's upper deck, laughing under bright strings of lights. Everyone was there. My son, my grandson, even my sister who lived 2 states away. Everyone except me. For a long moment, I simply sat there at the dining room table, the glow of my phone lighting the empty chairs around me. The candles had nearly burned out by then. I remember thinking how strange it was that after 65 years of birthdays, that was the first time I truly understood what silence inside a house could sound like. For a long time, I did not move from that chair. The phone screen slowly dimmed in my hand while the room around me grew darker. Outside the window, the streetlights glowed softly, casting long shadows across the dining room floor. 8 chairs stood around the table, each one carefully placed earlier that afternoon. Now they looked different, empty in a way that felt deliberate. I reached forward and gently blew out the last candle. A thin trail of smoke curled upward for a moment before disappearing into the quiet air. The roast chicken sat untouched in the center of the table, the skin no longer warm and crisp, but dull and cooling beneath the kitchen lights. I had cooked that meal the same way I had cooked for my family for more than 30 years. Slowly, almost mechanically, I stood up and began clearing the plates. One by one, I carried them back to the kitchen. The sound of porcelain touching the countertop seemed louder than it should have been. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Families do not simply disappear on a birthday without saying a word. I returned to the dining room and picked up my phone. Again, opening the photographs once more. The cruise ship behind them looked enormous, white and shining against the deep blue ocean. Everyone looked relaxed, happy. In one photo, Daniel had his arm around Laura while Ethan leaned against the railing beside them. The caption on another picture read, "Finally time for a real family vacation." I stared at those words for a long moment. A real family vacation. I wondered what that meant. I had always believed our small gatherings in this house counted as family too. I set the phone down carefully and walked to the sink. Warm water ran over my hands while I rinsed the dishes one at a time. My mind kept returning to small moments over the past few years. Christmas dinners that had been suddenly canceled. School events where I had been told the wrong time. Phone calls with Daniel that felt shorter every month. Laura had always been the one explaining things. Laura had always had a reason. Your mother probably needs rest, she would say. She has done enough already. At the time, those words sounded thoughtful, considerate even. But standing alone in my quiet kitchen that night, the memories began to shift slightly in my mind, like puzzle pieces that had not quite fit before. I dried my hands and walked back into the dining room. The table looked strangely formal now, like something prepared for guests who had chosen not to arrive. I folded the cloth napkins slowly and placed them back in the drawer. The house had never felt this still before. For decades there had always been noise here. Richard humming in the garage, Daniel running down the hallway as a boy. Even after my husband passed away 3 years earlier, the house had never felt empty like this. Tonight was different. Tonight the silence carried a question I had never allowed myself to ask before. I picked up my phone one more time and opened the photographs again, studying each smiling face carefully. Somewhere deep inside me a quiet realization began to form, slow and steady. Maybe this had not been an accident. Maybe this had been planned. I did not sleep much that night. The house seemed to settle around me in unfamiliar ways, every small sound echoing longer than it should have. Around 2 in the morning, I walked downstairs and made a cup of coffee even though I knew it would keep me awake. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the dark window above the sink while the coffee slowly cooled in my hands. My mind kept returning to the photographs on my phone, the smiling faces, the ocean behind them, the words beneath the pictures. A real family vacation. The phrase repeated in my head like a quiet question. When morning finally arrived, the sunlight filled the dining room through the large front windows, falling across the same table that had been set so carefully the night before. Everything looked almost normal again except for the untouched cake still sitting on the kitchen counter beneath its glass cover. I stood there for a moment looking at it before placing it gently into the refrigerator. Then I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat down with my phone. This time I did not just glance at the photos. I began reading the comments beneath them. Friends of Laura had written cheerful messages. You all deserve this trip. Beautiful family. Enjoy the sunshine. One comment caught my attention immediately. It was written by someone named Melissa. She wrote, "So glad you finally get a break from the drama." Laura had replied with a smiling face emoji and the words, "You have no idea." I read that line several times. A break from the drama. The words felt strange because nothing about my life had ever been dramatic. For more than 40 years I had done the same things most mothers do. I worked part-time at the local library while Daniel was growing up. I packed his lunches. I attended every school concert and every baseball game. When Richard passed away 3 years earlier, I tried my best not to burden anyone with my grief. I told Daniel many times that he should focus on his own family. I thought that was what good mothers did. I scrolled further down the photos and noticed something else that made my stomach tighten slightly. The trip had clearly been planned for a while. Several pictures showed them boarding the ship 2 days earlier. In one photo, Ethan was holding a small travel bag with a tag that read Caribbean Cruise. I leaned back slowly in my chair. 2 days earlier meant that while I had been shopping for groceries and decorating the dining room, my entire family had already been preparing to leave town. No one had mentioned a trip. Not Daniel. Not Ethan. Not even my sister Ruth, who usually called me every Sunday evening. I placed the phone down on the table and looked around the quiet kitchen again. A small thought began to form in my mind. Something quiet, but impossible to ignore. If the trip had been planned days in advance, then everyone had known about it long before my birthday dinner. Which meant something else must have happened as well. Someone must have told them not to come. That morning I walked through the house slowly, noticing small things I had not paid attention to before. The calendar on the kitchen wall still had a red circle around my birthday. I had written it there weeks earlier, a small reminder to myself that this year I wanted to do something simple but meaningful. Under the date, I had written the words family dinner in careful blue ink. I stood there looking at those words for a long moment before turning away. For most of my life, I had believed that misunderstandings in families usually had simple explanations. Someone forgets to mention something. Someone else assumes plans have changed. That is how small problems begin. But the thought that had formed in my mind the night before refused to disappear. If the cruise had been planned days in advance, then every person in those photographs must have known about it before my birthday arrived. That meant Daniel knew. My sister Ruth knew. Even Ethan must have known. Yet not one of them had called me. Not one of them had mentioned that they would be leaving town. I poured another cup of coffee and sat by the window again, trying to remember the last conversation I had with Daniel. It had been 4 days earlier. He had called briefly on his way home from work. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. I remembered asking him if he planned to come by later that week because my birthday was approaching. There had been a short pause on the line. Then he said something that had seemed perfectly normal at the time. He said, "We will see how things go." I had not thought much about that answer then. Daniel had always been busy with work. But now that small pause returned to my memory with unusual clarity. I finished my coffee and opened my phone again, scrolling through older messages. There were only a few recent conversations with Daniel. Most of the messages had come from Laura instead. She usually wrote simple notes on his behalf. "Your mother sounds tired today. We will visit another time. Daniel has a long week at the office. Do not worry about cooking for us this weekend." At the time, those messages sounded thoughtful, almost protective. But reading them again, now they seemed different somehow, as if every conversation between my son and me had quietly passed through Laura first. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the quiet living room across the hall. A memory suddenly returned to me from 2 months earlier. Laura had visited the house one afternoon while Daniel was at work. She had walked slowly through the rooms with a thoughtful expression, pausing near the large dining table where I was arranging flowers. I remembered her smiling politely while she looked around the house. Then she said something that had seemed like a casual remark. She said, "This place is so big for just one person." At the time I had simply nodded and laughed. But sitting there in the silent kitchen that morning, the memory carried a slightly different weight. For the first time I began to wonder whether Laura had been thinking about something else entirely. The rest of that morning passed quietly, but the thought Laura had planted in my mind would not leave. This place is so big for just one person. The sentence replayed in my memory while I moved through the house, doing ordinary things. I washed the last dishes from the night before. I folded the tablecloth and placed it carefully in the cabinet where it had been kept for years. I even opened the windows to let the cool air move through the rooms. Everything looked the same as it had the day before, yet something about the house felt slightly different, as if I were seeing it from a distance for the first time. Around noon, my phone vibrated softly on the kitchen counter. For a brief moment, I wondered if Daniel had finally called, perhaps realizing that something had been forgotten. But when I looked down, I saw Ethan's name on the screen instead. My grandson rarely called me directly. Most of the time, he sent short messages or quick photographs from school events. I answered immediately. His voice sounded cheerful and a little breathless, as if he had stepped away from something busy. He told me the ocean looked enormous from the deck of the ship and that he had never seen water so blue before. I listened quietly while he described the pools and the restaurants and the music playing near the upper deck. For a moment, I simply enjoyed hearing his excitement. Then he said something that made my heart pause in a way I could not quite explain. He said he hoped I was enjoying the quiet birthday he had heard about. I asked him what he meant. There was a short silence on the line before he answered in a slightly confused tone. He said Laura had told everyone that I did not want a party this year. According to her, I had said I preferred to spend the evening alone because I felt tired and did not want anyone making a fuss. I did not speak for a few seconds after hearing that. I simply watched the sunlight moving slowly across the kitchen floor while Ethan continued talking about the view from the ship. When he finally paused to ask if I was still there, I told him gently that I was listening. After we ended the call, I placed the phone down very carefully on the counter. The house was quiet again, but the silence felt different now. The question that had been forming in my mind since the night before finally settled into something clearer. My family had not forgotten my birthday. They had not simply become busy or distracted. They had been told something that made them believe they should not come. I walked slowly back into the dining room and looked at the empty chairs around the table once more. For years, I had believed the small distances growing between me and my family were the natural result of time passing. Children grow up. Lives become busy. People move in different directions. But standing there that afternoon, with Ethan's words still echoing in my mind, I began to understand that the distance may not have grown on its own. Someone might have been quietly building it piece by piece all along. After Ethan's call, the house felt quieter than before, but my mind no longer felt confused. Something had shifted. For the first time since the photographs appeared on my phone, the situation began to make a certain kind of sense. I walked slowly through the living room and sat in the chair near the window where Richard used to read the newspaper every morning. The sunlight coming through the glass fell across the wooden floor exactly the same way it had for decades, yet my thoughts were moving in a completely different direction now. Laura had told them I did not want a celebration. She had told them I preferred to spend the evening alone. I repeated those words silently to myself, testing how they sounded. They were simple sentences, harmless even. But the result of those sentences had been powerful enough to empty an entire dining room. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment, remembering other conversations over the past few years. Small things that once seemed unimportant suddenly appeared clearer. I remembered a Sunday afternoon when Daniel had planned to bring Ethan over to help me trim the hedges in the backyard. That morning Laura had called and said Daniel had a terrible headache and needed rest. 2 weeks later, Ethan mentioned casually that they had spent that afternoon at a shopping mall instead. At the time, I had assumed plans had simply changed. Then another memory surfaced. Last Thanksgiving, I had prepared a full dinner, expecting everyone around 4 in the afternoon. Around noon, Laura had sent a message explaining that Daniel believed I would prefer a quiet day after such a busy week. She said they did not want to overwhelm me. I had eaten that meal alone as well, though at the time I convinced myself it had been a thoughtful gesture. Sitting there now, those memories felt less like coincidences and more like a pattern quietly forming over time. I stood up and walked to the hallway closet where I kept a small wooden box filled with old documents and letters. Inside were papers Richard and I had organized many years earlier. Insurance information, property records, the original deed to the house. I had not opened that box in quite some time, but something about Laura's comment 2 months earlier returned to my mind with unusual clarity. This place is so big for just one person. I sat at the dining table again and opened the lid of the box slowly. The papers inside were neatly stacked exactly the way Richard had left them before he passed away. My eyes rested on the deed to the house, the same home where Daniel had taken his first steps and where every family holiday had once been celebrated. I ran my fingers gently across the paper, thinking about the years Richard and I had spent building this place together. Laura had walked through these rooms recently, studying the walls and windows with careful attention. At the time, I thought she was simply being polite. But now another possibility appeared in my mind, quiet and steady. Perhaps Laura had not only been creating distance between me and my family. Perhaps she had also been looking at something else entirely. Something that had been standing in front of her the whole time. I closed the wooden box slowly and returned it to the hallway closet exactly where it had been. The house was quiet again, but my thoughts felt sharper than they had the day before. For years I had believed that patience and kindness were the best ways to keep a family together. Richard used to say that people eventually reveal who they truly are if you give them enough time. At the time I thought he meant strangers. Now I began to wonder if he had meant something else entirely. That afternoon I sat at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee and my phone beside me. I opened the photographs from the cruise once more, but this time I studied them differently. Not with sadness, but with curiosity. Laura stood at the center of nearly every picture. Her smile looked confident, almost triumphant, as if the trip had been something she had carefully arranged. I noticed the way Daniel stood slightly behind her in most of the photos, his arm loosely around her shoulders while she faced the camera directly. It reminded me of the way she used to speak during family dinners, answering questions before Daniel had time to respond himself. I set the phone down and looked around the kitchen slowly. The house suddenly felt less like a place filled with memories and more like something valuable that someone might want to control. Laura's comment returned to my mind again. This place is so big for just one person. At the time it sounded like casual conversation. Now it sounded like an observation. I stood up and walked through the rooms one by one, noticing details I had never considered before. The large dining room window looked out over the backyard where Daniel had played baseball as a boy. The living room fireplace had been rebuilt by Richard himself one summer nearly 20 years earlier. Every room carried a piece of our family's history, but it also carried something else. The house sat on a quiet street where property values had been rising steadily for years. Even I knew that much. 2 months earlier, a real estate letter had arrived in the mailbox offering to buy the property for far more than I expected. I had thrown the letter away without thinking much about it. Now I wondered if Laura had noticed the same thing. I returned to the kitchen and opened my phone again, scrolling through older messages. Most of them were simple notes from Laura explaining why plans had changed or visits had been delayed. Each message was polite, thoughtful even, but taken together they created a strange pattern. Daniel's voice had slowly disappeared from our conversations. Laura had become the person speaking on his behalf. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window again. The situation no longer felt like a misunderstanding. It felt like preparation. If Laura had convinced everyone that I preferred to be alone, then removing me from family gatherings would seem perfectly reasonable. And if I slowly became someone who was always resting, always tired, always choosing quiet evenings by myself, then one day another idea might sound reasonable as well. Perhaps someone might suggest that a large house was simply too much for one person to manage. Perhaps someone might even offer a helpful solution. The thought settled in my mind quietly, but it did not frighten me the way it might have before. Instead, it brought an unexpected sense of calm. Richard had always believed that patience reveals the truth eventually. And now, for the first time, I realized that the truth might already be standing right in front of me. The afternoon passed slowly, but my mind was no longer drifting the way it had the night before. Instead, everything felt unusually clear, like a window that had finally been wiped clean. I moved through the house quietly, paying attention to details that once felt ordinary. The mailbox at the end of the driveway held the usual stack of flyers and bills. Among them was another real estate postcard offering to purchase homes in the neighborhood for cash. I stood there for a moment studying the numbers printed on the card. The amount was far higher than I remembered from previous offers. I slipped the card into my pocket and walked back inside. That evening I sat down at the small desk in the living room where Richard used to organize our paperwork. The lamp beside the desk cast a warm circle of light across the surface while I opened my laptop and searched for property values on our street. Within minutes, several listings appeared. Houses nearly identical to mine had recently sold for prices that made me pause. The numbers were far larger than I had ever imagined when Richard and I first bought this place decades earlier. I leaned back in the chair and looked around the room again. Laura had walked through these rooms carefully 2 months earlier, studying the windows and the walls with quiet attention. At the time I believed she was simply admiring the house. Now the memory felt different. I reached for my phone and opened my message history once more. The pattern I noticed earlier became even clearer as I read through older conversations. Laura had often been the one speaking on Daniel's behalf. She had explained why visits needed to be delayed. She had suggested that I rest more. She had encouraged quiet weekends instead of family gatherings. Each message sounded polite, almost protective. Yet the result of those small decisions had slowly reshaped the way my family saw me. Someone who preferred solitude. Someone who became tired easily. Someone who might eventually need help managing a large home. I closed the phone and folded my hands on the desk. For many years I had believed that family conflicts were loud things filled with arguments and raised voices. But what I was beginning to understand was something quieter. Some changes happen slowly, one small step at a time, until the final result appears perfectly reasonable to everyone watching. The crew's photographs suddenly made sense in a way they had not before. Laura had told everyone that I wanted to be alone. They believed her. Perhaps they even felt they were respecting my wishes by leaving me in peace. I stood up and walked toward the dining room again, stopping beside the table where the birthday dinner had been arranged the night before. The chairs were neatly pushed in now, and the surface was empty except for a small bowl of fruit in the center. For a moment, I rested my hand on the back of one of the chairs and allowed the silence to settle around me. Then I picked up my phone and opened my contacts list. There was one name there that I had not called in quite some time. Robert Hayes had been Richard's friend for nearly 30 years and had handled many legal matters for our family in the past. I stared at his name for a moment before pressing the call button. If someone had been quietly building a plan around my life, then it was time for me to understand exactly what that plan might be. I sat at the dining table for a long moment after the call connected, listening to the quiet ring on the other end of the line. When Robert Hayes finally answered, his voice sounded exactly the same as it had years ago, calm and steady with the quiet patience that had always made Richard trust him. I explained that I would like to meet sometime soon to review a few documents. I did not rush through the explanation, and I did not mention my suspicions directly. I I simply said that after turning 65 I realized it might be wise to organize certain things properly. Robert agreed immediately and suggested we meet the following afternoon at his office downtown. After the call ended, I placed the phone on the table and looked around the house once more. For the first time since my birthday evening, the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt purposeful. That night, I slept more deeply than I had in several days. The next afternoon, I drove the 20 minutes into town and parked outside the small brick office where Robert had worked for many years. Inside, the familiar smell of paper and polished wood brought back memories of Richard discussing insurance policies and tax forms across the same desk long ago. Robert greeted me warmly and asked how I had been managing since Richard passed away. I told him the truth. I said life had been quiet but stable. Then I placed the property documents on his desk and asked him a simple question. I asked him what would happen to the house and my savings if something unexpected happened to me. Robert adjusted his glasses and began explaining the current arrangements Richard and I had made years earlier. According to those documents, the house and the majority of my estate would eventually pass to Daniel. That answer did not surprise me. It had always seemed like the natural plan for our family. But as Robert spoke, I thought about the photographs on the cruise ship and the words Ethan had repeated over the phone. I thought about the careful messages Laura had written over the past several years and the quiet way those messages had changed how my family saw me. When Robert finished speaking, I nodded slowly and asked if those arrangements could be adjusted. He did not ask many questions. He simply opened another folder and began outlining several options that would give me greater control over how and when the property might change hands. We spoke for nearly an hour while the afternoon sunlight moved across the office floor. By the time I left, several new documents were already being prepared. That evening I returned home and walked through each room once more, noticing how peaceful the house felt as the sun began to set behind the trees outside. My phone vibrated a little later with a new message from Daniel. The cruise would end the next morning, and he wrote that they might stop by to visit later in the week. I read the message calmly and placed the phone back on the table without answering immediately. For the first time in many years, I realized something important. Patience does not only reveal the truth about others. Sometimes it gives you the quiet time you need to decide exactly what you will do next.